I'm very happy and honored to introduce Professor Francesca Trivellato. Professor Trivellato is the Frederick W. Hillis Professor of History at Yale University. She is a social and economic historian of early modern continental Europe and the Mediterranean. How broad, complex, and truly interdisciplinary her work is can be seen already from her studies track, following undergraduate studies at the University of Venice and a PhD in economic and social history, which she received from Luigi Bocconi University at Milan. She continued to complete another PhD in history at Brown University. The interdisciplinary nature of her work is spelled out in the title of books she co-edited, From Florence to the Mediterranean and Beyond, which appeared in 2009, Trans-Regional and Transnational Families in Europe and Beyond, Experiences Since the Middle Ages, which appeared in 2011, and more recently, Religion and Trade, Cross-Cultural Exchanges in World History, the year 1000 to 1900, which appeared at Oxford University Press, was published by Oxford University Press in 2014, almost last year. In addition to these co-edited books, and many articles and book chapters, Professor Trivellato's books include Fondamenta del Vetrai on Venetian glass manufacturing, which appeared in Rome in 2000, and the award-winning The Familiarity of Strangers, the Sephardic Diaspora, Livorno, and Cross-Cultural Trade in the Early Modern Period, Yale University Press, 2009. In her introduction to her Familiarity of Strangers, Professor Trivellato confessed, and I quote, "I have a predilection for connections that do not conform to the conventional map of geographical, political, and cultural borders of the time." And indeed, in her work, she draws fascinating, unexpected, and unconventional maps that bring together human experiences across geographical, chronological, social, and cultural borders. Professor Trivellato is the recipient of a number of fellowships and awards, and she is co-editor-in-chief of the journal Jewish History. She is currently writing a book on the history of credit in late medieval and early modern Europe, and it is on this topic that she will be talking today. I'm happy to invite Professor Trivellato to speak on Jewish-Christian credit relations and the economic history of early modern Europe.
Thank you very, very much to my colleague and friend Sarah Strumza and to the organizers of this conference. I'm very honored to be here, and thank you for putting up with my accented English. The talk will actually go back to some of the themes of this opening session of this afternoon. I think in particular Ishai Landa's talk, though earlier in time. And before I begin, I just wanted to mention that since the conference and the centers focus on relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, I wish I could have incorporated in my talk the question of credit relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in early modern Europe. I don't do so in part because it's not the focus of my research, in part because there were very few Muslims, but I want to mention that there is a growing body of literature, particularly in French, that looks at the ways in which Muslim merchants traveled on the European side of the Mediterranean during the early modern period, and the ways in which both Qadi courts and European courts recognized as a proof in courts contractual agreements. So there were actually credit relations that tied the Mediterranean in this period as well. And some of my remarks about the relationship between cultural and economic aspects of credit relations might perhaps apply to some other talks on Jewish, Christian, and Muslims credit relations. So let me begin, and we go back in time. Between January 1790 and September 1791, the National Assembly of the newly instituted revolutionary government emancipated the Jews of France. For the first time in the history of Europe, Jewish men acquired the same civic and political rights as their non-Jewish peers. Emancipation marked the formal transition from a society of status to a society of contract, to borrow Sir Henry Maine's influential formulation. That is, French society transition from an old regime in which individual rights were determined by the corporate group to which individuals belong. That's why, for example, a Jewish man in Metz would not be able to exert or to exercise an artisanal craft because all Jewish men were barred from belonging to artisanal guilds. And this moment with emancipation, a new social order was established in which all men of the same age and economic conditions share the same rights regardless of other differences, including religion and place of residence. Emancipation for women came more than 100 years later. So in this talk, we assume that men are the main focus of my remarks. Of course, the emancipation decrees of revolutionary France did not change the course of history overnight, and indeed the historiography of modern Jewish history or modern European Jewry is largely devoted to the unfulfilled promises of emancipation, a topic on which much ink has been spilled. My concern today is a different one. I wish to demonstrate that a better understanding of how Jews and Christians extended credit to one another during the 17th and 18th century, I should say, and the cultural valences attributed to these credit relations not only sheds new light on important chapters of Jewish history, but also forces us to rewrite the history of early modern Europe. I will try to show that the forms that Jewish-Christian credit relations took puts pressure on the homology between economic and cultural change that undergirds dominant accounts of the transition to modernity or the transitions from a society of status to a society of contract. Emancipation is paramount to the history of liberalism, premised as liberalism is on the freedom of every individual to enter into contract with other equally free individuals and to choose from a large menu of contractual choices. Emancipation has also been the subject of revisionist interventions in the field of Jewish history, which challenge earlier Germanocentric accounts and stress the multiplicity of roads leading to emancipation. The economic sphere is where scholarship on liberalism broadly conceived and recent historiography on Jewish emancipation meet. Among historians of 18th century European Jewry, especially Anglophone historians, an influential argument insists on the importance of commerce as a vehicle for new forms of acceptance of certain segments of the Jewish diaspora in Christian Europe. This current is part and parcel of a larger effort to conceive of emancipation as a gradual process rather than a sharp break. Thus, for Lois Dubin and David Sorkin, commerce accounts for the principal reasons why the so-called port Jews of Bordeaux, Trieste, Amsterdam, and London developed cultural traits and a legal status that set them apart from their Ashkenazi brethren. For these poor Jews, Sorkin writes, emancipation represented, quote, not a rupture or a radical departure, but merely a completion of a process. Just how gradual this process was and how deep it cut remain open questions. When, where, and how did the sign of an incipient transformation from a society of status to a society of contract emerge? My entry point in this enormously complex issue will be necessarily narrow, but hopefully instructive. I argue that a renewed focus on Jewish-Christian credit relations helps us glean insights into the history of Jews in the 17th, 18th century, as well as into the history of early modern Europe at large. After circa 1550, merchants across Western Europe were rarely organized in guilds, and Jewish merchants were rarely, though not entirely, were largely, though not entirely, unencumbered by legal restrictions in the contractual choices within the economic sphere. Does this mean that a republic of merchants existed in early modern Europe in which individual merchants freed themselves from collectivist structures? Was the market, as a principle and as a physical place, the site of an early transformation of segments of old regime society into societies of contract? In approaching these questions, we need to engage with the notion of cosmopolitanism, which in recent years has emerged as a cornerstone in these debates, whether in theoretically inflected scholarship or because of the proliferation of the casual use of the term, particularly in its adjective form, cosmopolitan. For what isn't cosmopolitan in the early modern world, as we come to have known it in the historiography of the past 20 or 30 years? The task of reviewing that literature will fill up the entire time for my talk, so instead I wish to offer a working definition of cosmopolitanism that will allow us to turn it, ideally, into an operative analytical category. I posit that we can speak of cosmopolitanism in the early modern commercial sphere when we find that economic actors made choices about to whom to extend credit to without regard for the religious identity of their borrowers. I say extend credit rather than buy and sell because in an instantaneous transactions there is no risk while credit entails risk. And I'll explain why risk is important to link the mechanics of economic relations with the cultural perception of the individuals with whom you enter into economic relations with. I also start from the assumption that in post-Reformation Europe, the importance of religion as an ordering principle of political and social hierarchies changed in many respects, but did not necessarily diminish. In today's terminology, what I call cosmopolitanism is an impersonal credit market. This definition is, however, deceptively simple. As soon as we begin to apply to what we know about merchant culture and business organization in early modern Europe, it reveals all its ambiguities. Early modern European merchants left an abundant paper trail, but I've yet to encounter a description of their thought process that is fully consistent with my definition of cosmopolitanism as an impersonal credit market. Although certain business letters do convey the sense that merchants took both religious identity and economic performance into consideration when choosing to whom to lend money. By contrast, if we move away from business records and examine instead the normative and self-reflexive literature of the time, whether mundane how-to merchant manuals or highbrow works of political economy and Enlightenment thought, we find that after the late 17th century and increasingly throughout the 18th century, commerce and cosmopolitanism were explicitly associated with one another. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, the noun cosmopolitan was first employed in English in Richard Hakluyt's Principal Navigation of 1598, which is a collection of travel narratives of European travelers who went overseas to, at the time, exotic, distant lands. Many of you will be familiar with some of the usages of the term cosmopolitan in the 18th century, including famous passages in which cosmopolitanism is pitted against religious obscurantism and located literally and metaphorically in the marketplace. The most well-known of these passages, because it's rhetorically formidable, appears in Voltaire's philosophical letters in 1734. And you can read it here. It says, enter into the London Royal Exchange, which is the market of commodities. Actually, it's not the financial, it's not the stock exchange, it's the commodity market, where the representative of all nations gather for the utility of mankind. There, the Jew, the Mohammedan, and the Christian behave towards each other as if they were of the same religion, and reserve the word infidel for those who go bankrupt. This passage from Voltaire is cited more often than others because the ideal it expressed, this passage is cited more often than others, but the ideal that it expressed by the 1730s had become a literary trope, particularly in England, and it kind of was borrowed from the Netherlands. Spinoza has a very similar adagio, in fact. Against this most eloquent depiction of the triumph of the pursuit of profit over religious prejudice, descriptions and engravings of the time depicted the London Royal Exchange as a space organized according to corporate collectivist logic. This is one of the many of these many engravings of the time. You can see here comes from a 1756 Dictionary of Trade, and it shows the Royal Exchange, that the Royal Exchange continued to allocate its floor space to distinctive groups that are, described by a number of different taxonomies. Some are geographical, some are occupational groups, some are religious, ethnic groups. The point, we don't know exactly what the reality was, but there are many of these depictions that show that in the imagination of the time, the what I called the society of status still was very much imprinted in everyone's mind, not just in the legal, but also in the cultural world. Since Albert Hirschman's pioneering work on the theory of the so-called du commerce, several critics have exposed the fallacies of those that Hirschman called political arguments for capitalism before its triumphs. Yet it is fair to say that 18th century pronunciations such as Voltaire's continue to have a very deep resonance and have blended easily with modern liberal views of the market. They provide the building blocks by which we have come to conceive of capitalism and pluralism as historically interdependent. An intellectual historian, Thomas Haskell, has even explored the connection between the rise of capitalism and the rise of humanitarianism and argued that both are predicated upon the tendency to keep promises made to strangers. You may ask what's wrong with assuming the existence of a close relationship between commerce and cosmopolitanism in the ways in which Voltaire and so many others posited it. I wish to suggest that at a minimum, to take this relationship for granted has generated a circuitous way of thinking and led us to a historiographical deadlock. If we take at face value descriptions of the marketplace as a melting pot avant la lettre, we will likely consider it redundant to engage in large-scale research projects aimed at assessing the actual economic practices of those merchants who paced the floor of the Royal Exchange. And here I'm not talking about hypothetical cases, because for the most part, for most cities of early modern Europe, we still don't know much at all about who traded with whom and why merchants may have been inclined to conduct certain economic operations with certain groups and not others. At the opposite end of the historiographical spectrum, we encounter a different but related problem. Economic historians inevitably stumble across merchants who did trade across linguistic, religious, and political boundaries, and these then become favorite candidates for the adjective cosmopolitan. But the challenge here is how to move from empirical studies of business practices to extrapolating cultural meanings associated with those business practices. How can we move beyond this impasse? How can we bring together the history of ideas about cosmopolitanism with what has been called the cosmopolitan as a lived category? So in the rest of my talk, I will in part outline a research agenda that centers on the history of Jewish-Christian credit relations, and that I hope can offer a new answer to these very complicated problems. And it is a research agenda that hinges on the two inseparable dimensions of credit, the economic dimension and the symbolic dimension. Because when a creditor decides to lend money, he or she has to evaluate it, what chances they have to be paid back. And the underlying assumption in most of economic history is that lenders assess the creditworthiness of their borrowers on the basis of the individual characteristic of borrowers. Yet, we also know that there is a way that we also know that collective stigmatization has historically played a great role in the credit markets. And in fact, it's almost paradoxical that today, at least in the Anglophone world, I don't know if that's different in other historiography, in other scientific literature, social scientists study the visible and invisible forms of discrimination in labor, housing, and credit markets in today's liberal democratic societies more than historians have used this question of what is the role of collective stigmatization in order to interrogate the transition from a society of status to a society of contract and the way in which the early modern marketplace worked. Assumptions about the closeness of family ties, or conversely, the cosmopolitan nature of merchant networks in pre-industrial Europe, have obstructed obvious research patterns. When did symbolic representations affect individual business decisions? And what do individual business decisions tell us about the commercial culture of the time? Now, in the very great scheme of things, and this is a bit of a simplification, but it's important to keep in mind, the rise of impersonal markets entail essentially a transition away from a commercial world in which group identification is not only necessarily but also helpful to curtail the risks inherent in poor transportation and in poor legal and communication system. This is the world of trust among kith and kin, in which intra-group peer monitoring offers protection from the general insecurity and unpredictability of the commercial world. And the early modern Jewish mercantile diaspora conformed to some extent to this model. In this ideal type scheme, the transition unfolds, therefore, along a continuum that moves away from close-knit credit relation to our modern liberal and democratic world, in which mathematical models and the rule of law make it possible to for people's creditworthiness to be based exclusively, supposedly, on observable individual characteristics rather than on stereotyping. Now, it's obvious to all of us, I think, that the end point of this ideal type arc is hardly an accurate description of the world in which we live in. Today's credit markets in the US, for example, are affected less by overt discrimination by gender and race, which was outlawed not so long ago, actually in 1974, and more by the structural inequality of wages by gender and race. My interest in early modern Europe stems from the fact that early modern Europe sits uneasily between these two extremes of the ideal type transition that I just described. On the one hand, early modern Europe remained a corporate society governed by the principle of separate and unequal status, and riddled with such high information asymmetries that it was useful to rely on intra-group economic networks. On the other hand, the commercial expansion of Europe, the creation of new credit instruments, improvements in the transportation technology and the printing press, as well as developments in commercial law, all converged to mitigate the risk of extending credits to members of different corporate groups. The early modern period as a transitional phase in the rise of impersonal markets coincided, and this is not coincidentally, though the causality lines I think are complicated, but it is not a, it is worth noting at least that the rise of impersonal credit markets coincided with the integration of Jews, and particularly Jews of Iberian descent, into European commercial society. And yet, I want to emphasize this was an uneven integration. And for this reason, Jewish-Christian credit relations offer a revealing litmus test for how cosmopolitan, in my definition, the commercial world of early modern Europe was. I'm going to cut a little bit and just jump to the story. So you'll all be, I think, familiar with this map that depicts the migration out of Iberia after the forced conversions in the 1490s in both the crown, both the Spanish and the Portuguese crown, and the establishment of a number of Sephardic, Western Sephardic colonies, both in Italy and in Atlantic Europe. And these migrations were engineered thanks to a number of new policies of toleration that were devised by certain European countries. And what is peculiar to these new policies of toleration is that they demanded that the Jews settle in, say, Livorno, Venice, Hamburg, Amsterdam, and after 1566 in London, that these Jewish merchants be actually involved in inter-regional and long-distance trade. And in some ways, the charters actually forbidden explicitly to Jews any involvement in second-hand clothing or small retailing that had been their traditional occupation in the late modern period, in the late Middle Ages, and particularly there is in some Italian charters an emphasis on the distance of these Sephardic Jews from pawnbroking and money lending. So this sort of echoes the question of the relationship between different forms of capitalism and different forms of both commerce and financial relations. And as a result of these policies of tolerations, Jewish-Christian business relation expanded considerably in spite of persistent social barriers between the two groups. And naturally, when I say Jews and Christians in this talk, these are very capacious terms. There are a myriad of different specifications one could have. There are obviously poor and rich Jews. There are Christians of a number of denominations. But I think that the labels Christians and Jews are still valid even in this in their generic equality, because until emancipation, it's forbidden from Jews and Christians to intermarry. And intermarriage and family and ties and intra-community ties are so important to the ways in which credit work that this particular barrier, I think, is one that is crucial to understand how the kind of questions I'm raising. So not only the business relations between Jews and Christians become more and more intertwined, but these are, since you're all very versed in these topics, I don't need to go too much at length about it. I think these are two pictures that capture very well the level of acculturation of these so-called Western Sephardim. So to your right, there is the portrait of a Sephardic merchant who lived inside the Venice ghetto. Okay, so he lived, the doors were closed every night, and here is a portrait holding the engagement ring to the woman who's going to be married to Sarah Belilios from another prominent Sephardic family. To your left, you see the Ketubah of dating from 1760, from some after Judaism is openly accepted in the southwest of France. And here you see that the marriage contract is signed with Latin script. So these are Jews who actually are, you know, they write in French and they sign their name in French. So the rest of my talk, I'm going to try to give you a sense of how I'm thinking about the ways in which we can understand the coexistence of prejudice and economic cooperation. And this is obviously something that exists throughout history and has some specific characteristic in each time and place. And so I'm going to sketch in very broad terms the contours of what is still a research project rather than give you really the meat of my research. And so I borrow from some of my work and the work of others, and I also hint at questions that are still to be explored. And I will confine myself to the Western Sephardim, both because they are particularly integrated in this international commercial society, and I take advantage of the fact that my friend and colleague Glenn Diner will speak tomorrow about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That is also, you know, that's a sort of another context in which Christian-Jewish economic relations are very close and very important in the 18th century. So, but I have the fortune of having ability to gloss over that. So in the rest of my talk, I will proceed in 3 steps for this broad overview. And the first step consists in outlining the legal changes that made it not just possible, but actually not too difficult for Jews and Christians to extend credit to one another in pockets of Western Europe in the 17th and 18th century. So first I'll start with the law, and then I will draw from some of my own work and some of research is still in progress to show that Jewish-Christian credit relations were highly selective. And I'll point out cases from Livorno and Amsterdam, which were the 2 capitals of Sephardic settlements in the West. And finally, I will raise some questions about what happens when we juxtapose these findings about the legal framework and the business practices with the textual and visual representation of Jewish credit that circulated in Christian Europe at the time in order to broach the thorny subject of the relationship between business practices and mental constructs of those practices. So first, the legal framework. And here we ought to stress that changes in Christian regimes of toleration were equally important as changes in Jewish law, because both facilitated the integration of Sephardic merchants in European commercial society. So in extreme synthesis, by the 16th century, commercial papers signed by an individual who was publicly known as a merchant had legal validity in court, even if they did not carry the seal of a notary or another public authority. These mean that if somebody was known to be a merchant and wrote a letter or wrote an account book and kept that in their own counting house, they could one day bring that to court as proof that a credit relations existed and that they wanted to be repaid. This is something that happens in late medieval Italy and then migrates to Antwerp and then to Amsterdam. So it makes it makes business records much more formulaic, but it also makes it much faster and cheaper for a merchant to keep their records, so they don't have to constantly go to a notary and pay the fees to have things stamped and so forth. A second and related change concerned the transition from the collective to the individual legal responsibility of Jews. In the Middle Ages, Christian authorities routinely assigned collective blame to an entire Jewish community for the wrongdoings of one of its members, whether the crime was real or imaginary, as in the case of blood libels. After the mid-16th century, the fiscal responsibility remained a corporate assignment managed by community leaders, but in the realm of commerce, as a rule, a regime of individual rather than collective legal responsibility prevailed. That means that an individual Jewish merchant with a piece of paper in which he had written in a vernacular European language business records could go to court and use that as proof of a credit transaction. Now, this is not to say that Jewish merchants ceased to worry about their collective reputation. For example, the 1688 crash of the Amsterdam stock market fueled accusations that Jewish brokers had caused it. Community leaders responded by forbidding congregants from buying and selling stocks in the vicinity of the Portuguese synagogue. But in 17th century Holland, even the most inimical fantasies about Jewish conspiracies to rob Christians of their money never led to any collective sanction. Another set of important transformations swept across the Jewish world in both Western and, I believe, Eastern Europe, and many rabbis relaxed halakhic prescriptions in economic matters, including in matters of usury prohibition. Religious leaders in the newly created Sephardic communities of Western Europe had to display particular leniency because Sephardic merchants routinely used bills of exchange and other financial instruments that strictly legalistic interpretation would deem usurious. In Venice, Rabbi Simone Luzzatto, who lived in the first half of the 17th century, issued perhaps the most candid approval of Jews' handling of bills of exchange by a rabbinical authority. In Livorno and Amsterdam, moreover, remember, the Jewish tribunal was composed of laymen who were normally merchants and bankers themselves. They were not ever a rabbi, and habitually incorporated customs and rules of Christian commercial law. You probably know, if you've seen it, that the herem against Spinoza is actually written, it's actually signed by the merchants who are the rulers of the Amsterdam Jewish community. The rabbis had instigated it, but the rabbis would not have the authority. So it's a very different kind of balance of power in these Western Sephardic community. Finally, growing commercial relations with Gentiles led Jews to infringe more and more often the prohibition of bringing their lawsuits before non-Jewish tribunals. Wherever there is trade, there is litigation, and records show that by choice and by necessity, Jews appear before non-Jewish courts on a regular basis to defend their credit relations. So taken together, these legal changes leveled the playing field and eased credit relations between Jews and Christians. We do not have a complete map of these legal changes, but it wouldn't be too difficult to draw it. The second step in my research agenda is more complicated because the secondary literature tends to document the presence of Jews in specific economic sectors more than to ask if, how, and why Jewish economic organization might differ from the non-Jews who are active in the same sector, which happens in many times and places. Here I draw from existing and ongoing research on Livorno and Amsterdam, and in both cities we noticed there existed multiple credit channels between Jews and Christians, and yet we still do not know exactly for what type of economic ventures Jews and Christians pooled their money together and for which ones they stuck to their own communities. Considerably more statistical data needs to be gathered to paint a full picture of these patterns, but a few preliminary hypotheses can be presented. We know, for example, or I think we know, that Jews and Christians invested together in task-specific, time-bound, and by the 17th century, highly standardized contracts, such as marine insurance or freight shipping. The risk involved in these contracts, even when they were across community lines, was rather low because recourse to a secular tribunal was possible and easy. Marine insurance contracts, for example, were registered in pre-printed forms, and if a lawsuit ensued, courts were generally well equipped to deal with it. There were very standard default rules about how to, solve conflicts over marine insurance, about how to gather information about whether a shipwreck or a piracy attack had had. So everything had become fairly routinized, which is why for those contracts we find a lot of Jews and Christians having contractual relations with one another. It was much riskier to invest money in partnerships that were set up to fulfill a variety of non-specified tasks over a long period of time. No matter how many clauses a partnership contract contains, the partners will still need to make decisions that could not be fully anticipated. And for this reason, throughout the early modern period, many, if not most, private merchants set up their partnerships with family members, because family members were, it was easier to monitor them. And so in these family firms, as a rule, all the partners were unlimitedly liable. So any contractual relations that any member of a family partnership would enter into, everyone else was liable. So there was no separation of liability. But family members were not always adequate source of capital. So in much of continental Europe, though not in England until 1907, private merchants had recourse to a type of contract that is usually better known by its French name, Société en commandite, which is essentially a limited partnership. And limited partnerships allowed external investors to reap profits from commerce without being overly exposed. External investors in a limited partnership received dividends on their contribution and could never lose more than they had contributed. The principals of these partnerships instead, they were fully liable, including with their family assets, for any losses that a limited partnership might incur. Scholars have long viewed limited partnership as key to the rise of Western capitalism because they broke down, as it says, so it's supposedly said, the association between family and business. In fact, Max Weber's little-known dissertation from the 1880s is on the rise of limited partnership in late medieval Genoa, and that's sort of his theory about the importance of the law in the construction of the rise of capitalism. Recognized in Florence since 1409, limited partnerships were routinely used by Christian merchants in early modern Tuscany to raise capital among aristocrats who had considerable savings but shunned direct involvement in commercial ventures. Both Christian and Jews used this legal form, though Jews perhaps proportionally less so. Out of nearly 2,000 limited partnerships registered in Tuscany between 1630 and 1800, only 3 had Jews as active managing partners in Livorno and Christians as passive external investors. And these 3 are all from the 1770s. This is a strikingly low number if we consider that Jewish merchants were the most active in Livorno and no legal prohibition existed against the joint Jewish-Christian limited partnerships. The business and court records of Livorno are filled with evidence of credit relations between Jews and Christians, some that generated disputes and many that they tied their lives together. But the virtual absence of limited partnerships raises a red flag. It prompts us to ask what social and cultural barriers were erected where legal ones were torn down. One expects to find much thicker credit networks between Jews and Christians in Amsterdam, the most tolerant of all European cities in the early modern period, and the one with least discriminatory legislation against foreigners. That may be the case, but the verdict, in fact, is still out because scholars have been so obsessed with the rise of modern corporation, the East India Company, and the stock market, which was first created in early 17th century Amsterdam, that in fact we have a very little secondary literature on private partnership. And I'm currently working on a large-scale data gathering project together with colleagues in the Netherlands to classify the types of contractual obligations between Jews and Christians in early modern Amsterdam, including the structure of partnerships agreement, to see whether the patterns that we begin to see in Livorno were the same or were very different. The point I wish to drive home is that we have little to gain from simply identifying the existence of credit relations between Jews and Christians. To understand when and where religious boundaries persisted in the period before Jewish emancipation, we need a much more fine-grained pictures of the conditions under which economic actors pull their money together. To do so will give us a measure of their perception of risk and by extension of the perceived cultural proximity or distance between merchants of these different groups, a measure, in other words, that will link the study of business practices with the study of cultural perception. The third and last building block of the research agenda that I'm sketching for you asks whether and how ideas about Jews, the subject of intellectual, cultural, and religious history, evolved in relation to changes in the organization of Jewish economic roles, and whether and how they matter to the actual conduct of trade. Put simply, did the mercantile world forge a sort of pragmatic tolerance, as is often stated or implied, or did it remain sensitive to prejudicial representation of Jewish commerce? We know that medieval ideas about Jews as infidels in the economic realm, that is, as merchants who lacked fama, who lacked trustworthiness, survived in the realm of ideas. Meanwhile, in the 17th century, Christians forged new images of Jewish merchants, those that Benjamin Brodie called the myth of the Sephardic Superman. What did these ingrained theological and popular views of Jews mean to the everyday practice of trade? And how, in turn, did renewed Jewish-Christian credit relations affected those ingrained views? These are huge questions, and in the few minutes left, I will put a more modest versions of them on the table. When and how did prejudice affect the credit ratings of individual Jewish merchants? At present, we don't have an answer because historians of ideas and economic historians have parted ways more often than not. But as long as we don't seek to answer this question, the nexus between commerce and cosmopolitanism will elude us. One concrete entry point into this thorny question will be to test the stress that financial crashes had on individual Jewish-Christian business relations. Considerable ink has been spilled to examine the anti-Semitic backlashes. There's been a lot written on the anti-Semitic backlash that followed economic crisis, even in tolerant Amsterdam. The 1630 collapse of the tulip trade, the crash of the Amsterdam stock market in 1688, the bursting of the South Sea bubble in 1720 that sent shockwaves across the channel. All these incidents brought to the surface a not so well disguised Christian resentment against Jews and their overrepresentation in the financial sector. Medieval cliches about Jewish usury, the opposite of charity, were adapted to accuse Jews of engaging in reckless and self-interested financial dealings with no regard for the Christian Commonwealth. In fact, recently, this famous book printed in the 1720s in Amsterdam, The Religious Ceremonies of the World, which is sort of a manifesto of religious cosmopolitanism, within quote, has been singled out for its anomalous absence of any attacks on Jews amidst the violent pamphlets and engravings that decried the perceived causes of the 1720 stock market crash. Now, on the other side of the channel in London, Tory politicians heralded an analogous association between Jews and manipulative stock jobbers, but neither in England nor in Holland was the morality of trade per se questioned. Rather, bad credit was Jewish. So that much we know, and yet we know less about what were the repercussions of these hostile images of Jewish credit on the daily business relations between Jews and Christians. Did Calvinist profit-seeking merchants steer clear of issuing a bill of exchange on experienced Jewish borrowers after holding anti-Semitic engravings in their hands? Or, if they didn't, does it mean that they were immune from prejudice and armed with only factual knowledge? Or maybe inflated images of Jewish economic prowess, even paradoxically, might have created even greater ease in between Jewish-Christian relations, as somebody suggested to me. Crude as they are, these questions lurk behind our narrative of the relationship between commerce and toleration in early modern Europe, and would benefit for a more systematic treatment. Let me conclude by returning to the Enlightenment thinkers that I left behind, and specifically with the principal 18th century theorist of the du commerce. In a well-known passage of his 1748, The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu wrote, quote, "The laws must prohibit nobles from engaging in commerce. Commerce is the profession of equal people." Montesquieu's struggle was how to reconcile a defensive of the monarchic order and the landed aristocracy with his praises of commerce's many virtues. By his own account, commerce cures destructive prejudice, fosters Gentile mores, and even leads to peace between nations. A feudal lord from near Bordeaux, Montesquieu is the name of his baron. He was named Baron de la Brede de Montesquieu. So he was a feudal lord from near Bordeaux. The French thinker remained wedded to an old regime society of status. He thus never questioned what does it mean, equality, when he says commerce is the profession of equal people. He never really questions what equality means among merchants. His own Bordeaux is often heralded as one of France's cosmopolitan Atlantic ports. There, new Christians, and after 1723 new Jews, mingle with Catholic and Huguenot merchants along the docks and in the city's Academy of Sciences. Did Montesquieu have them in mind too when he proclaimed commerce to be the profession of equal people? Did their equality in contractual ability, which was well established since 1550, erase religious prejudice in the economic sphere and replaced wealth and creditworthiness as the only criteria of distinction? How did the Gradis, the Da Silvas, and the many other Sephardic merchants of Bordeaux who were excluded from membership in the city's Chamber of Commerce choose to whom to extend credit and for what purposes? A great deal more needs to be done empirically and analytically to find satisfactory answers. If I remain wary of the casual use of the term cosmopolitan, I hope to have shown, albeit in very broad strokes, how a research agenda centered on credit relations between Sephardic Jews and Christian merchants in early modern Europe can do more than pay homage to our own contemporary obsessions, and rather demonstrate both the centrality of Jewish history to European history and advance our understanding of the relationship between economic organization and cultural forms in the emergence of Western modernity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating, I'm almost tempted to say a cosmopolitan lecture. It's a late hour, but if we have one or two questions, I think we can take that. And oh yeah, please. Yes.
What or when did similar relations develop in the German-speaking states?
That's pertinent and for me not so easy to answer questions, but in extreme synthesis in the late 17th and 18th century. The Jewish economic roles in the German-speaking land are polarized mostly between the court Jews who are the financiers of the prince. So there the contract, the credit relations are bound with political ties. There is also a very large kind of peddling economy, and there's a lot of Christian resentment that is voiced in a number of petitions, sort of at the lower end. Now, in between these, the top and the bottom of the of the Jewish economic hierarchy, there are some large financial fairs, particularly Frankfurt and Leipzig. I didn't do a close study of these, but I think it would be an interesting topic because the regulations of these in these fairs, there is both commodity trade, so there are goods that are bought and sold, sometimes at the moment, sometimes at credit, but there are also very sophisticated financial markets where merchants and bankers buy and sell paper instruments that are promises for future payments, and they discount them, and they sort of essentially speculate on financial currency arbitrage. And the regulation of both the Frankfurt and the Leipzig fair show that Jews were somewhat present. They're marginal compared to the role of the Western Sephardim. But there are regulations. For example, I remember one about whether a Christian merchants had to go in the house of a Jewish merchants to do transactions. So these spatial construction of what can be done in public and what should be done behind closed door. There are some. But the Jews are not, as my understanding is that they're not as immersed in the sort of this middling commercial economy in the German-speaking world as they are in the port cities of, in Amsterdam, Bordeaux, or London, or Livorno.
Any more questions? Yes, please. Yes.
I really appreciate the emphasis on trust. I think it's very clarifying because if a community like the Jews were to obtain a reputation for untrustworthiness, then the whole system would collapse. You couldn't have these credit relations. So I'm really curious where the accusations of Jewish untrustworthiness are coming from, because it can't be coming from the business community. People, otherwise, people just wouldn't lend or borrow from Jews. So do you have a better sense of exactly what is it? The church? Is it the Enlightenment-based reformers? Like, who's responsible for the rumors of untrustworthiness, and does anybody really listen?
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you, Glenn. You're absolutely right, and in these Sephardic communities, it's particularly interesting to see how, because these are communities that are formed just a bit of by individuals who most often had lived as Catholic for more than one generation. So there is, first of all, an emphasis on re-Judaizing, if you want, these emigres, and one of the forms that the effort to create some religious conformity, one of the goals also has the goal of monitoring the behavior of all these merchants who belong to the community. In the community statutes, there isn't too much emphasis on economic behavior because they're written by merchants themselves who don't want to subject themselves to too much control. But it is evident that there are short temporary harems that are issued for transgressing what is considered proper economic behavior, precisely as you said, because there's a heightened sense that the collective reputation that has to fend off most of the case fantasies, but also sometimes reality, because there are bad apples in every community. So that is one aspect of how the religious and the economic interest, in some ways, the rabbis who want to create greater religious conformity can find an ally in the merchant who rule the community, because they have collective reputation as their meeting ground. I don't think most of the Christian allegations have to do with untrustworthiness as we would define it today in the modern literature. There are variations on a theme, but they're more about Jews looking out for themselves at the expenses of Christians. That would be the theme. So the untrustworthiness would be more in the intention or about the kind of contractual agreements that are signed. You're right that I don't think there is a prevalent theme of Jews as untrustworthy in the sense of reneging individual contracts, as much as the contracts themselves are denounced as not being fair, whether in terms of Jews exploiting Christians, which is a very it's a theme with a very long theological pedigree that in these 18th century period takes on a very secularized form. For example, the word usury in the 17th and 18th century becomes a near synonymous with economic malpractice. And that's where some of the themes we were talking about in the afternoon session, what is a kind of a religiously inflected or Christian theologically inflected accusation then melds with a more generalized sense in which Jews maintain a certain figurative function. So though when somebody would be called a usurious Jews in the 17th and 18th century, it didn't have to do with the interest rates. It just meant financial practices that could be labeled as being exploitative. So that I think it's a more frequent type of cliche that is mobilized, as opposed to untrustworthiness as we understand it in the literature about what are the social, cultural, perhaps, and legal mechanisms that compel merchants to abide by their promises. So that's a clarifying point.
I think we will close here. We'll thank you very much again. And thank you. Good evening.
Thank you for this thing so late.